I was recently going through a number of folders and files and videos that are archived, and I found this following lecture, and I'm pleased to present it to you. This is easily titled Living a Good Life or Living a Significant Life. And as I presented this, I really think that this has application to anybody who follows Messiah, but in particular, I was thinking of this in the context of people who have an artistic interest, and whether this artistic interest is in video, whether it's in music, whether it's in sculpture, graphic art, or dance, or a variety of other areas. I really think that for an artist who follows Messiah, we need to have a foundation and an understanding of the kind of life that we really ought to be living. So without any further ado, I want to present this to you, and I trust that if you have an artistic interest, that it will be useful to you. And I also trust that if you have an interest in following Messiah more effectively, that you will also find this interesting. Thanks so much. One of the things that when you spend too much time in academics ends up happening is you get an opportunity to get past all the stuff that they want to teach you, and you end up being able, on a certain level, I think it's called the doctoral level, to start studying the things that you're actually interested in. And most people give up on academics because they don't get it to a high enough level where everybody else runs out of material. I'm a Jewish believer in Jesus who grew up in the body of Messiah, and the whole relationship between the church and the synagogue never made any sense to me. And so I was able to do a doctoral dissertation on what had happened between the church and the synagogue. And some of the answers I came up with were not the same answers that everybody else came up with. So what ended up happening is the opportunity to do a doctoral dissertation on the relationship between the church and the synagogue, and ended up giving opportunity to answer an age-old question for me. This class is going to answer another age-old question for me. And this age-old question that this class is going to address for the next number of weeks between now and the beginning of Hanukkah is this. You read about what Yeshua said the body of Messiah should look like. You take a look around and you see what the body of Messiah kind of looks like in contemporary times, and they don't look much like each other. Is that fair? Anybody else notice that? Mm-hmm. The body of Messiah that Yeshua originally set up was a body that was intended to change the world. And in the first generation or two after Yeshua's resurrection, they really did change the world. The body of Messiah, as it's currently set up, is a spectator sport, where you go, you hear somebody do something, you evaluate the product, you determine what it's worth financially, you make a contribution, and then what ends up happening is at the end, hopefully you leave in better shape than you got there in. But a lot of people really treat what's going on around them as though the pastor is an ordained ministry, the pastor does ministry, the rest of us kind of show up and support it, and then what ends up happening is we're upset that the pastor doesn't accomplish all the ministry that needs to be done in our geographic region. Am I being fair on this? Okay. And if the pastor doesn't do a good job, we change the pastor. Because he's the one who's supposed to do ministry, right? And what ends up happening is if you get a particularly good pastor in your area, what ends up happening is everybody goes to his church, and his church gets bigger and the other churches get smaller. And there really are gifted people who do well, and there's people who, quite frankly, should be driven out of business because they don't do well, okay? And I don't actually have problems with that part of the process. The problem that I have is that in moving forward the kingdom of heaven, we are not moving forward what God has given us to do. And so I'm looking at this going, maybe there is a problem with how we view the world. Maybe things can be different. And I've collected a bunch of different books, and I'm going to be giving you guys a course curricula, or a syllabus rather, that is going to end up having the list of the resources that I'm working through. And so if you want to read them before I get to them, you may know as much or more about the subject than I do. But really, in terms of this, what I'm hoping for is I'm hoping over the next number of weeks to take those who are in this class and convince you of a couple things. The first thing that I'm trying to convince you of is that God has a call on your life. Now, some of you already believe it, some of you don't. Okay, but in terms of this, God has made you for something. And I really believe that in terms of this, if we get in the flow of what God has made us for, we will end up having greater fruitfulness. And I think that we will do things in such a fashion whereby we will help other people get into what they're doing. Another thing that I'm hoping to do in terms of this is some of you are going to take a look at your lives and go, you know what? I'm in exactly what God has made me to do. And if you are in exactly what God has made you to do, this is going to be a point of real affirmation of what's going on already. For some folks, we're going to look at this and we're going to go, I'm not doing what God has made for me to do, and why am I not doing this? And so some are going to go, I'm right where I need to be. Others are going to go, you know, I function just fine in what I'm currently doing, but I really don't feel like this is what God made me for. And so as we're going through this and as we're working on the different parts of this, I'm hoping that what's going to end up happening is that some of you are going to go, I'm going to quit on my current life, or I'm going to start making a transition to move from what I'm currently doing to putting more time into what I feel I need to be doing. And you know, I'm going to be talking to you about this stuff out of my own relationship with this. One of the things that ended up happening is I was reluctantly and unwillingly called into ministry myself. I did not want to go into ministry. I wanted to be left alone. I wanted to be able to be a studio rat in Los Angeles. I wanted to be a technician who helped extraordinary musicians make great music and make recordings. And had I had my druthers and my own choice, I'd still be doing that at 55 years old. But God kind of grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, got me into seminary, and I did fine in seminary, but I dreaded what was coming next because it was ministry. And as some of you who've known me for a long period of time, you know, like Liz, just how magnificently successful I have been in building large organizations and having people shout Hosanna when I come into the room, okay? And I'm being utterly sarcastic about that. Now, it's not that there hasn't been fruitfulness, and it's not that it hasn't been effective, and it's not that it's not a life well lived. It's just not the one that I was hoping for, or the one that I was looking for. But over a period of time, I've learned an awful lot in terms of this. And one of the things that I've learned is what not to do. So as I talk to you about certain things that are going on, I learned early on in ministry, the first 5 to 7 years I was in ministry, I spent all my time doing stuff I wasn't good at. Maybe it wasn't all my time. Maybe it was only 70 or 80% of my time. But sometimes what ends up happening is we compensate and we spend all of our time working on the things that we're not good at, and then we get to a point of extraordinary frustration and we say, I hate this life. And I've been there with ministry, and perhaps you've been there with other things as well. And you get to a point where you say, I hate this life, and you go, God, why have you put me in this life? And it was extraordinary to me when I got to a point where I realized that God had made me and that God didn't have a call on my life that was in diametrical opposition to what he made me to be. And when you get to that point where you're giving yourself freedom to become the person who you're really supposed to be, I'm not saying that you won't have to do stuff you don't like to do, because I still do that to this very day. But I've really gotten to the point where I've tried to make that a minimal amount of the time that I put into this, and the time where the giftedness and where what I seem to be able to do and what seems to bring results, I try and put more time into that. I really believe that when Yeshua talked about the pearl of great price, that we who pursue knowledge and pursue understanding and pursue wisdom, we need to be a people who are in pursuit of what we want to get out of it. So this is permission in this class. When I'm talking about stuff and you're going, I need something, we need to have a discussion. We need to have an interaction. We need to have things happen. You need to ask the questions you need. We need to talk about it. We need to be open to the possibility that it's not going to be Steve who's got the answer, but it's going to be Emily, or it's going to be Noah, or it's going to be Liz, or it's going to be somebody else who has the answer to this. So I'm not looking for a straight lecture format. I'm looking to talk about things that are significant and that are real. Now, we are videotaping this seminar. I would really appreciate, there's a microphone sitting right there. If you've got a question, let me know you got a question. I'll recognize you. We'll get the microphone to you. Noah will give you your turn to go, and then we will catch the question, because it's possible that this course is going to develop based on your responses. And the second and the third time around that I teach this, what's going to end up happening is I'm going to have been educated as much by you as you were by me in terms of how people respond to this material. So if you feel like, oh no, now I can't ask any questions, you may be robbing me and the others of significant and important input that we need to make this work. The purpose of this class is designed to investigate the process by which an individual can discover and pursue the destiny which God has made them. This will include taking stock in their life up to this point, evaluating perceived success and failure in their journey, dreams and longings which refuse to die, and map out the steps needed to move the process forward. As we are on this journey, there will be an evaluation of what everybody knows, which may be mistaken. This change in perception is designed to train modern people who will operate in faith and in a worldview consistent with how the apostles and other biblical heroes operated. As a point of introduction, Beit Shalom is a Messianic Jewish congregation which we have, for almost the entire history of this congregation, had somewhere between 15 and 65 people who show up at services. We have never been wealthy. We have never had significant backing. We have never ended up being a congregation which everybody envies and goes, oh, wow, they have so very much. There's been a couple things that have been goals for this congregation in this community. One is we believe the Word of God ferociously over even our own experience. God has said all Israel is going to be saved. We believe God has given us a call that has a hand in helping bring to pass what God has promised. Secondly, we have never been in a position where we really trust that we can pull this off. We've always believed that we're utterly and absolutely dependent upon God. Thirdly, what has ended up happening here is we have believed that the key to God's heart is being a people of worship, a people of praise, a people who experience the presence of God. And that the moving of the Spirit of God in our midst is the only thing that is going to rescue us from who we are left to our own devices. And so these have been key and core ingredients to who we are. The next thing that's happened is, as God has sent us people, we have tried, sometimes not as well as other times, we've tried to have the ministry and the growth of the community be based around what God sends us. Years ago, people would come to me and say, Steve, we really need to do something for the poor. And I say, that's a great idea. You want to do it? And they start backing towards the door and say, oh, no, I wasn't planning on offering to do anything. I just think you ought to do something for the poor. what we've been made to do, we need to do. Now, there are many good ideas that aren't things that God has brought up. And there's many good ideas that need to be done, but if we don't have people who will pray it into being, if we don't have people who will put their lives and their hearts on the line, if we don't have people who will do stuff, it may not be our season, it may not be our time, or we may not be the body that is called to do that. So we need to operate within the context of who we are. A lot of years ago, we were getting garbage out of the building. We were refurbing this building that we had purchased many years before that. I was sitting with a guy who was terribly disappointed because he had been stabbed in the back by another Christian organization. And this guy who had been stabbed in the back by this other Christian organization was helping us. He had broken his wrist. He was limited in terms of the amount of hard work that he could do, but he could paint. And so he was painting here. And this guy who was painting and was limited physically in other ways, one day we'd both been working hard, we were dirty, we were sweaty, we were grimy. We sat down on a break together and he said, "You know, Rabbi, what I'd like to do?" And I said, "I have no idea what you would like to do. Tell me what you would like to do." And he said, "I would like to be able to talk to Jewish people on the radio about Yeshua." And the guy who sat down and talked to me about it didn't realize that he was in the midst of a sea change. Because what had happened was, before this, in order to talk on the radio, you needed an FCC license, you needed a transmitter, you needed all this equipment, you needed an FCC licensed engineer to run everything and make sure you were running things properly, and it was a very expensive thing. And at this point in time, in 2005, we were on the point where broadband internet was starting to be distributed commonly through the United States and through the rest of the earth. And there was this new thing on the horizon called internet radio. He didn't know it was coming. I knew it was coming because I was a geek and I just liked following that stuff. But at this point in time, his vision met the change in technology and the change in the world. And out of Dave Zeckler sitting down and talking to me came the genesis and the birth of a Messianic Jewish internet radio station. And so the vision of somebody else and the vision of what the congregation was called to ended up coming together to the point where research was done, where we took a look at what was going on, where we were concerned about litigation, we were concerned about getting in trouble with rights organizations, where we had to figure out how we were going to be able to do this safely. But what ended up happening is we ended up having the establishment in 2006 of a Messianic Jewish internet radio station, which people have listened to all throughout the earth, and which there have been over 700,000 total listening hours of people who have listened to that station since its inception. And some of these people have been Messianic Jewish believers, some of them have been Christians with a heart for Israel, some of them have been unsaved Jewish people, and some of them we have no idea why they're listening. But there has been an opportunity out of a building in downtown Utica to touch people across the earth. And it was interesting because with the Shalom Institute, we were promoting the Shalom Institute at a homeschool conference in Massachusetts. And when we were doing this, what ended up happening is a Messianic Jewish believer came up to our booth, and it says Shalom Institute. He figured we might have something to do with Messianic Jews, particularly in that realm. He talked to us. We're talking to him. It was really good fellowship. We met his wife. We met some of his kids. All this kind of stuff is going on. And we just mentioned in passing, oh yeah, our congregation does all sorts of stuff, and we're looking at starting this institute. But in addition, we run this internet radio station called Sounds of Shalom. He said, "You run Sounds of Shalom?" And we said, "Yeah, we do." He said, "My father, who lives in South Africa, loves Sounds of Shalom and listens to it all the time." Not what I was expecting. You see, here's my vision for the world. God has made people to do specific things. And often what ends up happening is we are willing to just do what's necessary to put food on our table and shelter over our head. And sometimes we're not unlike the hobbits that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote about, where they just want a nice, safe, pleasant life and want to be left alone. And some character comes along like Gandalf, who sets these hobbits on adventures that they are unlikely to go on left to their own devices. I think that actually Yeshua is into adventures myself. And so perhaps there is opportunity for us to do some things that are a little outside of what we would do left to our own devices. What constitutes a good life? Does anybody have any people that you can think of, either people you know, people in history, people who are contemporary celebrities? I mean, just any names that you would come up with. Does anybody want to nominate or propose anybody whom you think is living or has lived a good life? Good. Patty is saying that she is living a good life. Who else do we have? If you guys expect an entire lecture thing, I'm going to terribly disappoint you on this, okay? I really need a little bit of, we're in a small enough group to the point where there can be interaction, there can be stuff going on.
I'll say something. There's several people that I would point out and say, I really respect them. I wouldn't say necessarily that they're living a good life.
Okay. Who would you respect?
A few people that I met through my travels with streams that I heard what they had to say in their beliefs about God, and I realized I really respected them for what they believed.
You know that there was an individual in Scripture that God described as a man after God's own heart. The guy was an adulterer. He was a murderer. He was a career soldier. He killed people regularly. He ended up having people who were under his administration whom he said, I can't control these people. There was all sorts of intrigue. He lost control of his family. His daughter was raped, okay, and there was a whole variety of other things that went on in his life. And honestly, none of us would want the things that went on in his life. And in the end, God said, this is a man after my own heart. I would propose that despite the difficulty and despite what went terribly wrong in his life, King David lived a good life. Notice I didn't say a perfect life. I said a good life, and a life of meaning, and a life of significance, and a life that as he lived it, God said, it is through you and through your offspring that I'm going to bring salvation to the world. Okay, so by a good life, I'm not necessarily meaning a perfect life, but a life that's worth living, okay? And I don't think, I'm hoping that we don't have a standard such that what's going on is, it's going to require perfection, okay? And you probably suspect that I'm asking this question and that I'm doing this course. I think that there's some things to discover about living a good and an excellent life. But one of the things that ends up happening is this course is of no use, and the discussion that we're going to have and the material that we're going to have is of no use to people who don't want to live that kind of life. So part of what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be working on seeing if I can create a hunger in us to live something good and something extraordinary and something real. I don't believe that life is simply made to be extraordinary for a few leaders, for people who end up being the stars of our generation. I believe that our culture has a tendency towards hero worship, and whether it's in academics, whether it's in entertainment, whatever field it happens to be, people tend to live their lives vicariously through other people whom they think are doing better than they are doing. And I really think that that's blocking us from being who we need to be. And I think that the life that you are living is a life that God has designed. You know, we say that we believe that we are made to do good works in Messiah, and that he has planned good works for us to do from the foundations of the world. We also say that we believe that those who seek first the kingdom of heaven, all the other things that they need will be added to them. And then the culture and the society tells us that what we should end up doing is we should end up living a safe life and make sure you have a 401k and make sure you have a good professional job and make sure you have the training and the certification, the qualification, so people will pay you more than other people are paid in your society. And you should end up making your life safe. And you should end up having security. And you should make sure you have enough money to retire comfortably and make sure that you've done all the right things. You can't believe both things. Either those who seek the kingdom of heaven will have all these other things added to themselves, or you should look out for number one. But you can't hold both of those belief systems at the same time. Does this make sense? I believe that there is a life of significance for anybody who will throw themselves into it. But I think on a certain level, part of what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to throw away the anchor. And we're going to have to give up certain other stuff to live this life. And I believe that there's a life of significance that's involved for us. There's no question that I should ask of you that I shouldn't expect to answer myself. So in terms of this, the question ends up being, who do I know of who lived lives of significance? The man who originally ordained me in 1989 was a Messianic rabbi. His name is Jonathan Bernis. He has lived a life of significance. He pastored a Messianic Jewish congregation in Rochester, New York. He got to a place where he went on a trip to the former Soviet Union and found a hunger for the gospel that was unlike anything he had ever seen. He left being a Messianic Jewish rabbi in upstate New York. He started a ministry, and the ministry that he started put together festivals in the former Soviet Union. He has probably been the one man of our generation who has seen more Jewish people receive Yeshua as Messiah than any other living man in this time. After that ride was done, and after the harvest came in, because it was something that was seasonal, and it waxed and waned. After that was done, he ended up finding other countries where there were people who would respond to stadium-style evangelistic events. And then he has started a television show that he runs out of Phoenix, Arizona. He has his hand on the pulse of the Messianic Jewish world around the globe, and cares very definitely for unreached people groups and for people groups that may end up coming to a place where they are becoming receptive. So Jonathan Bernis is a guy who I think has lived an effective and a good and a significant life. I have had some people who have pastored me who I think have lived effective, significant, and good lives. Lloyd John Ogilvie, who was a pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood, California. He has lived an effective and a fruitful and a good life, to the extent that I've been able to see the fruit of his life and be involved in being a congregant of his for a 4 or 5 year period. Jack Hayford of Church on the Way in Southern California, who had established the institution through which I got my Doctor of Ministry, has had an effective and a fruitful and a good life. Now, these are a couple people who are in ministry, okay? And so I'm starting there, okay? But these are not the only people who have lived effective, fruitful, and good lives. Okay, and I've also mentioned some people who are well into what they have done. Part of what is going on here at Beit Shalom is we have a group of young people who have a desire to live a good and effective and a fruitful life. And some of the young men who I'm pastoring, who are in their 20s, I believe are going to end up having similar impacts in their societies and in their worlds. And I believe that these are people who are making space and are making a place for effectiveness and fruitfulness to take place. You know, so often we end up measuring significance by fame, okay? And part of the easy thing in terms of talking about this is we can talk about famous people because people have heard of these people. And it's a point of common culture. But what if what God is doing is he is using those as examples, but he is causing us to move into other areas? One of the things about starting the Shalom Institute is I'm meeting people who in the media arts world are living fruitful and effective lives. We had at the end of August a conference that the community was invited to that was a setup for the Shalom Institute. And one of the people who came was a friend of mine that I was in a prayer group when I was in my mid-20s with. He has gone on to be nominated for a Directors Guild Award for Best Documentary, something that he did on China back before China was open to the West, as it would become over the next generation. He covered the Iraqi War, being the video director for Peter Jennings, and the reports that Peter Jennings did from Iraq. He has worked on television shows. He has done a variety of different things. He has maintained his faith in Messiah. He has maintained a witness. He has done a work in Hollywood of showing what it looks like to be a believer in a business where there aren't a lot of them. He is living an effective and a fruitful life, and you would never hear of him. There's a gentleman who's an audio systems integrator in Toronto, Canada, who is also part of our team, and he has become an inventor, and God drops ideas into his spirit about ways that things can be done technically that people have never done before. He has a company where he has taken the area where digital systems control and mechanical devices kind of meet along the service of audio, and he is creating devices that major touring companies like Cirque du Soleil and major rock and roll acts and other people are buying his devices that attach to the truss rods of major stages that allow them to do things they could otherwise never do. He's living a life where the Spirit of God has given him a gift of creativity. He's using it, he's doing manufacturing, and his primary problem at this point in time is that he is in a place where he cannot produce these things that he is making fast enough, given the demand. And he's grown a business that's just gone through the roof. He's living a life of significance. He is having an impact in a world where Jack Hayford, Lloyd John Ogilvy, and John Burness will never go. There are other believers who have been embedded in parts of the world, and take a look at where you are and where you have your influence. They're not going to listen to a world-class Presbyterian pastor. They're not going to listen to a guy who has been the executive director of a Messianic Jewish ministry. They're not going to listen to a guy who has run the Foursquare denomination. But God has put you in there. And to the extent that you are free to be who you really are, this is key and this is critical. One of the things that I'm hoping is that for those of us who are going to be in this course, that we are going to be able to be free to be who we really are. So often what you do as a believer in this life is you don't live out of what God has made you to be. You live out of trying to protect yourself from being discovered for what's wrong with you. So someone who is fiery and who's passionate wants to make sure that they don't lose their temper. Because we will be judged by losing our temper. And we will get absolutely no credit at all for being a person who has a zeal and a fire and a passion for the things of God. Do you understand this? There are people who I have heard about who have lost their temper, and 5 to 10 years later, people are talking about that one time where they lost their temper, okay? And it might not have been a good event, okay? But that shouldn't actually define who they are as a human being. If you don't believe that this is Yeshua's core value, I want to remind you of one of the guys who was very closest to Yeshua, who was Shimon Kepha, or Simon Peter. And he promised that he was going to be with Yeshua through Yeshua's greatest test. And Yeshua said, before the cock crows in the morning, you'll deny me 3 times. And at the end of the book of John, what ends up happening is Yeshua ends up taking Peter alone. And 3 times, Yeshua says to him, do you love me? And at the end of each time, Shimon Kepha says, yes, I love you, Lord. Yeshua gives him an instruction, which is restorative. This guy was the prototypical, either incredibly brilliant or incredibly stupid, but always operating out of a sense of passion. He was not defined by his greatest failure, because his greatest success was ahead. And I'm hoping that for some of us who believe that we have been defined by our greatest failure, we will allow the work of the Spirit of God to do a work in us to the point where we are going to end up being able to have our greatest successes ahead of us. Does this make sense? And sometimes what ends up happening is people aren't willing to attempt to live a life of significance because they believe that they have disqualified themselves from living a life of significance. Sometimes you think that there's something in your past that has happened, whether it's something that you believe is disqualifying or something that you believe other people would think is disqualifying. And so what ends up happening is we give up. And we figure the very best thing we can do is live a life of quiet desperation. I am challenging that right now. I don't believe that all God has left for you is to live a life of quiet desperation. And one of the things that is going to be telling about you is if you can get to a place where there are people whom you believe, and mind you, none of us know anybody else's heart, okay? But you can see the fruitfulness and you can see how a person lives their life. If you get to a place where you can identify those whom you respect for the lives that they're living, it will tell about your values, because you will all pick different people as people whom you think are living lives of significance. And what you value will be evident by the people that you choose whom you think are living lives of significance. If you value someone who's doing a helps ministry, if the people who you think are living lives of significance tend to be in the healthcare arena. Maybe that's what God's made you to do. If the people whom, I told you, I gave you 3 people off the top of my head who are significant, and they all have ended up having ministry impact on other people. It tells you about my value system, right? So in terms of the people whom you recognize as having lived lives of significance and having lived a good life, the people that you choose and you say, these are people who appear to me to be living a good life, it will speak of your values because that's what you're attracted to. And you see, ultimately, at the end of this, we want to discover what should happen for you. Beit Shalom is starting a messianic, is starting an institute, and we are starting an institute, and we realize that we, being 50 people, cannot affect the entire world. But what we can do is we can end up having a hand in making part of the world better. And the way that we chose having an institute that was going to be in media arts and biblical studies is we took a look at what we were already attracting and what we already seemed to be having success in. Does this make media arts and biblical studies more important than anything else? Absolutely not. We need people to end up being embedded into all parts of the society. We need success across all boundaries and across all channels. All we have done is we have sought a beachhead where we can start having an impact upon the culture. And there are some here who are going to have an impact in all different parts of society. I don't want you to feel like if you're not doing media arts and biblical studies, what your contribution is unimportant or insignificant. We are not here to end up making it so that everybody does exactly the same thing. We are instead here so that each person can discover what God has called them to do, empower, equip, set free, so that you can end up having an impact in the world around us. So I don't want to make a whole bunch of people who do exactly what Steve does. I want Steve to be a mentor who helps you discover what it is that you're supposed to do and create a world whereby the world changes and you are doing what is going to be significant. One of the things that ended up happening, the first thing that I discovered that I loved was music and technology. And the intersection of where music and technology came together, I loved living there. As a child, I had mixed dominance, also known as dyslexia. I ended up having a tough time. There were a couple moves that my dad needed to make in terms of his career, and a couple of these moves were difficult in terms of social things. So I moved from White Plains, New York to the North Jersey Shore in 2nd grade. It was in the middle of the school year. The schools did things entirely different. I ended up getting left behind, in part because of the learning disability, in part because the school calendars had nothing to do with each other. And there were gaps in my education in terms of what 2nd grade was supposed to do, because one school did it in the first half of the year and the other school did things in the second half of the year, and there was just stuff missing, okay? Being left back in elementary school is not a fun event. Okay, there are labels that come with this. And then what ended up happening is the other unfortunate thing about the school that I ended up at as a destination was a K through 8 school. Usually what ends up happening is when you end up introduced into a new school, you are the odd duck until you end up going to another school where there's feeding in from other students who don't know each other. So I got the great opportunity of spending 6 years in a school where it seemed like everybody else there had all been born in a single hospital and had lived in a single community their entire time. Not a fun event, okay? but it happened. One of the things that ended up happening as a result of this is I learned to end up enjoying my own company. There are events that happen in your life that shape who you are. And some of these events are events that you are going to perceive as being positive events, and some of these events you are going to perceive as being negative events. But you have been shaped by what has gone on with you. And until you come to a place of peace over some of the things that have happened, you are going to be struggling with things. And as people of faith, and as people who know the Word of God, is it possible that God has designed us to do these things in such a fashion where the things that we loved and the things that we have hated have been all part of the crucible that God has created us in? As a result of my elementary education, what ended up happening is my love of music and my love of technology came together to the point where I got an opportunity at 13 years old to get a minimum wage job where I was running sound reinforcement and I was recording jazz and classical concerts. So this was in the North Jersey Shore, and what ended up happening is I had more jazz and classical musicians who were my friends than people I went to school with. And so as a result, the people who had played with Duke Ellington, the people who had played with Count Basie, Marion McPartland, who's known from having a jazz radio show that was on public broadcasting for many years, all these people ended up becoming the people that I hung with and the people who were my friends. Whereas the people who were in my elementary school, not so much. In the midst of this, it's really interesting because I ended up becoming a Messianic Jewish rabbi, and Messianic Jewish rabbis, one of the rules is if you're going to do this, you can't care what the Jewish community thinks of you. Because they don't want you to be in their town, and they will try and isolate you, and it takes a certain amount of courage and backbone to do this job. I wasn't without support as a child. It just came from different sources. And it was a harder run. And I'm a little bit more of a difficult person today because of it. There's a certain backbone that comes with some of these things. And actually what ended up happening is after I got out of 8th grade and went into 9th grade, it was wonderful because I had learned to play trumpet and I had gotten involved in the high school marching band and I had truly excelled at this. And in my sophomore year, I was the best trumpet player in that section. And the band director said, let this other guy be the first trumpet player because he's a senior, he's going to graduate. You're going to have the next 2 years of being my lead trumpet player. And he knew it. And then between my sophomore and my junior year, my parents moved to another school district over the summer when I was out of town. And it was gone. And the old band that I was in operated like a family and really loved each other. And the director would have done anything for his musicians. Extraordinary mentor. The new guy was from a working class background, and he had a bunch of stockbrokers' kids in his band, and he hated them. And he was jealous of them, and he didn't like the kids that he was directing in the band. It was just a job to him. Stuff happens. You need to... Part of the reason that I'm going through this is because I am going to give you an assignment at the end of the evening. And your assignment is going to be 12 events that have formed me into the person that I am now. And I think it's going to be a 2 to 5 page paper, okay? And you can't simply say, walking across Genesee Street against the light, okay? That's, you have to give the event that has helped form you, and then have a bit of a discussion in terms of how and why that event formed you. And this is one of those things where I won't know if you pick the real events that have really been formative or if you've picked fluffy stuff, okay? But I would really recommend that in terms of this, you end up taking the events that have been really significant and really personal, because these are the events that this class is a class of self-discovery. If you're going to be a person of significance, you need to know what has caused you to be who you are. And for me, there's a lot of things. I mean, I've told you about moving into a school and being left back in 2nd grade. I've told you about mixed dominance. And I've told you about finally socially integrating into a school environment and then losing that at the point of at the point where I was ready to flower and succeed. It was gone. Okay? Those are all really significant events for me. Now, falling in love with Deborah, really significant event. Deborah's death, really significant event. You know, having to leave behind being a recording engineer in Los Angeles when that was my life goal, really significant event.
And we have to limit this to 2 to 3 pages?
Hey.
2 to 5?
I'm saying 2 to 5 pages meets this. If you write way more than this, I'm good. Okay? If you write more than this, it's good. Okay? But I want a dozen events that have happened in your life that have been significant and have helped shape you. Okay? And being bullied was a significant event for me. It's made me a very difficult person when I think that someone's about to bully anybody who's under my care. You need to know these things about yourself because it will help you unfurl the flag. It will help you live a life of significance. It will help you come to terms with who you are. Because we have been shaped. And so often what ends up happening is we look in the mirror and we hate who we are. Or we wish we were somebody different. Or we go, if only I wasn't. If only I were quicker. If only I didn't look like this. If only I wasn't so passionate, people could accept me. If only these other things hadn't happened. If only I had avoided the trouble and the difficulty that was in my life. If only this event hadn't happened to me. But by taking these dozen events and going, this has shaped me, on a certain level, what ends up happening is we start to get to a place where we can start to evaluate the life that we've had. And we can start to go to God, okay, this was significant. I think it's damaged me. You thought that I didn't need to be saved from having this sort of event. What is your purpose in my having gone through this? And if you've already done this, the paper will go faster. If you haven't done this yet, what's going to end up happening is the paper may end up being the most significant assignment you're ever given. Because it will be like Jacob wrestling with the angel. So in terms of this, Anybody got any comments on what contributes to a life being lived that's significant or meaningful? How does someone live a meaningful life? Have you ever asked that question of yourself? Because we all want to live with that. Emily. Okay.
I just think that people who have lived significant lives have not quit, and they've gone through the struggle. If they've had something difficult in their family, the family has somehow worked it out. When you asked someone that we pictured as having a good life, I immediately went to the media, not so much to real people. Mm-hmm. But I pictured the Little House on the Prairie family, Laura Ingalls Wilder. Okay, you too? Good. And those folks weren't rich, they weren't popular, but they struggled and they worked through all kinds of things. And I think that was a life of significance, and I thought it was a very good life, and it's a good example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have a comment? Or? Yeah.
God put upon my heart a long time ago that be satisfied where you're at, but anxious for more. You know, accept where you're at, accept what you've got, embrace where you're at, but don't stay there. Mm-hmm. You're always looking. You're always looking. You know, I've always thought about the what ifs. There's what ifs in my life that, what if this happened? You talked about.
Yeah.
What if this happened? What if this didn't happen? But there's what ifs in your life that you can change. I don't want to grow old saying what if. Mm-hmm. So Denise and I have a happy life. We embrace every moment, whether it's crossing the street, waking up in the morning, seeing each other when we get home, whatever it is. And but we're anxious for more. We're embracing this moment in time, but we are anxious for more. And for me, I've learned it later in life, but it's still significant to me. That's where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have some components of what a meaningful life would look like? Or what could be components that would help put together a meaningful life?
I'm just looking at, I listed a couple of people when you were asking for examples in our own personal lives. And I have a couple of friends that I really respect. And I have a couple of people that I don't know that I hope someday to meet. Corrie ten Boom and Mother Teresa are very amazing people to me. Mm-hmm. And I think what speaks to me about them and what draws me to any story I ever see about them is how they were just in the gap between life and death for other people. Mm-hmm. And that just inspires me. And it is something that, for me and for those two women, altered the course of their life.
Do you see how the choice of those two women, there's a commonality for Emily that speak of her values? Does that make sense to you? Mm-hmm. And the people that you respect are going to be people who are going to speak to your values and speak to your heart and speak possibly to what God's called you to. Okay. We admit that there's significance. We admit that there's meaning. We see people who have meaning and significance in their lives. Does anybody have any ideas, just if we're going to brainstorm, and this isn't a yes or no or a right or wrong kind of thing, but how could we infuse our lives with more meaning or more significance? Anybody got any ideas?
Let the dreams take hold. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that no matter what experience, bad or good, that you at least take something from it and learn it.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a good example.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. You want to do that again?
Let the dreams take hold.
Okay.
I'm 54 years old, and I've missed a number of dreams in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not living there. But I'm trying to take. I'm looking forward to the dreams that we're trying to put together right now. We're living some of the dreams, and we're still yet to live some of the dreams that God's put upon our hearts.
It's interesting that you mention this, because one of the texts for the course is going to be The Dream Giver by Bruce Wilkinson. Is anybody familiar with this book? Okay. This book, the author of this book was famous for the book that was before this. And the book that he had written before this was called The Prayer of Jabez. Okay. And this book is the response that he wrote. He wrote the Prayer of Jabez, and people said, okay, well, what do you do if you, like Jabez, pray that prayer? What comes next? This is the sequel to it. And so there's going to probably be one of these classes where I'm going to outline the book. I'm going to talk about some of the principles in the book, and we're going to go there. Okay? And so one of the things that ends up happening, I believe, is that Wilkinson says that he believes that everybody has been given a dream. And that what ends up happening is some people do live their dreams, and other people, what they do is they suppress their dreams because they don't think it's possible for them to succeed at living their dreams. And so it'll be an interesting conversation, but that is part of what we're going to be treating in upcoming weeks. You know, one of the things that does end up happening is everybody who was alive in 1900 has one thing in common. They're all dead now. And what is going on is we only get so many days. And if you only get so many days, you will give your life for something. And one of the questions ends up being, what is worth giving your life for? And what have people given their lives for? Because on a certain level, nobody hangs on to their life. And one of the things that really made my wife's funeral far easier for me than it would have been under other circumstances is that I had never met someone who was so prepared to see Yeshua as my wife was. Okay, she had lived a good and a fruitful life. She had lived her dreams. She had done the things that she wanted to do. She was able to fiercely give herself to learning all sorts of new things. There were points where she wanted to learn Messianic Jewish worship dance. She did it. There were points where she wanted to learn to do artisan bread baking. She did it. There were points where she wanted to learn to play clarinet. She did it. There were points she wanted to learn to play percussion. She did it. There were points where she wanted to care for people. She did it. Okay? And it just, whether it was a small thing or whether it was a large thing, she gave herself to it. She had actually read The Dream Giver at one point in time, and she said to God, well, did you give me a dream? Okay, because she thought that her dream had simply been to be a mother and to raise kids, and we had 5 kids together, and she had raised the kids, and it was all going well, and she thought, well, maybe that's my dream. Maybe that's all. And one day she was going for a walk up near the golf course near our house in the country, and she asked God, have you given me a dream? Is there a dream? And God gave her an assignment, and this was a writing assignment. And he pointed out to her an obscure passage in the book of Judges and said, I want you to write about this story. And the story he wanted her to write about was a story about 2 women, one of whom had her name and one of whom had our daughter's name. It was the story of Deborah and Yael. And so she got her assignment from the Lord, and she discovered that her dream that she had had before she was ever a believer in Messiah was to be a writer. And she proceeded to become a biblical fiction writer who wrote 4 extraordinary novels. And so, that was her discovering her dream, when she was in her 40s. And when she was already fighting cancer. So, I don't know what God's got for us, and many of us may be running our dreams already. Many of us may have run through various dreams that we've done. Many of us may feel like there's a couple of dreams we've missed. Okay, but that doesn't mean that what God has placed in your heart, and even what God may have placed in your heart a long, long time ago, may not be something that God isn't ready to actualize and release you into now. And when you are doing what you are created for, you are living a life of significance. We're very fortunate that in this current age we can do this. And we need to live these lives of significance, knowing that there is no guarantee that everything will always be the way that it is right now. But let's give ourselves to being able to do what we can do, powered by the Spirit of God right now. And no, I loved what you said earlier, Liz, where you said it's not a matter of when you end up hitting the moment, all of a sudden things change, but it's a matter of the living this life day in and day out, month in, month out, year in, year out, practicing these spiritual disciplines that cause you to be able to be a person that whatever the storms are that come, all of a sudden you're ready for them. Big deal. So everybody has the assignment for next time. And the assignment is 12 events in your life which contributed to forming you into the person that you have become. Identification of the events and some writing about why these events are significant and important and how they have formed you and who you are because of what happened. So that's what I've got for tonight.